Much, Liz. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Amalia Săbiescu, and I'm joining from Loughborough University, London. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Oonagh Murphy. Hello and welcome, Oonagh. Thank you for joining us. A few words about Oonagh's work and research. Oonagh is based at the Institute for Creative and Cultural Entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, University of London, where she is a lecturer in arts management. But beyond being an academic, Oonagh is also an arts manager and a writer. Oonagh's work explores the scalability of emerging technologies such as AI for cultural organizations. Oonagh is a leading international expert on AI and museums, and one of her recent projects is the Museums Plus AI Network. As principal investigator of this project, Oonagh secured funding from the AHRC to bring together over 50 digital leaders from the UK and the US to explore models of ethical AI practice within the cultural sector. And before handing over to Oonagh, some practical matters for our audience. We will have a 30 minutes talk, more or less, followed by more or less 15 minutes Q&A. We will take questions only by text, so not by voice. Please feel free to write your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A form. And I think that's all about it. Thank you. Welcome again, Oonagh. Over to you now.
Brilliant. Thank you for that introduction, Amelia. So I'm just going to share my screen. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Always fun to have some technology problems on it. So I want to begin just by thanking the Institute for Advanced Studies for inviting me to speak today. In many ways, the way I've kind of framed this talk is that of a warm-up act. So I've really approached the session as scene setting and really to provide a bit of an introductory context to the work that's currently happening in galleries, libraries and museums, that will then be expanded upon in more depth through the case studies that are going to follow this afternoon, which are much more in depth on specific projects. So really the point of this session this morning is to provide that wider contextual and ethical framework and really to situate that practice that's currently happening in museums. Next slide. When it comes to discussing AI, the conversation often turns to these really interesting contradictory narratives. So utopian dreams where work is carried out by machines and we enjoy a constant life of leisure. Next slide. Through to this kind of narrative of dystopian disasters where freedom and creativity has vanished. Slide. Or a totalitarian robot state which is taken over. Slide. The reality is likely to be more nuanced and exists somewhere between the utopian and dystopian fiction that prevail in popular culture. Indeed, if we think about 2022, neither utopian nor dystopian narratives fully depict the use of machine learning in our everyday lives. Slide. Yeah, actually, I'm going to do this a few times. So if we go next slide. Next slide. Yep. Yeah. So machine learning really helps to filter and spam our inboxes, and it helps us to structure our emails. If we think about Citymapper and Google Maps, they really help us to travel in the most efficient way possible, responding to live conditions and also recalibrating journeys as we move. On the web, search results are improved, meaning that we can find what we're looking for quickly, but it also limits any serendipitous opportunities for discovery, whether that's to find an article about an unknown female scientist or a local hairdresser who doesn't pay to advertise. Slide. The thousands of photos I take on my phone on a monthly basis are neatly tagged and categorized so I can search for pictures of my birthday or look for the picture I took of a receipt during my last work trip. However, The computer only sees what's in front of it and not the nuance and context that's there. At the bottom of this slide, you can see a picture of my family with candles. Google Photos thinks this is a birthday because it sees candles. It's actually a Christmas party from a few years ago. Slide. Alexa and in extension, Amazon employees are listening to users' conversations, but Alexa, can't really understand my Irish accent. And so my arguments with her often seem to outweigh any useful assistance they provide. Slide. So where are we at? AI filters my life and my experience is more efficient for it, but the trade-off for an efficient life is less opportunity for discovery and a life viewed through the prism of those that programmed the machine. So I think it's fair to say that the landscape is pretty complicated. Slide. What we do know is that AI needs data, and museums are by their very nature data-centric institutions. They are collectors and creators of a diverse range of data, be that the bone density of a dinosaur, the market value of an artwork, the most viewed collection item on their website, or how long visitors spend in a particular gallery. These data sets and the ethical and legal frameworks that govern them are complex, a complexity that is in part drawn out of the differing motivations and rationales for the collection and creation of these data sets. From reporting to funders, to developing new insights into audiences and gaining deeper understanding of collections. The data collected, processed, and held in museums today is rich, but it's also varied in its intent. Slide. Let's begin by surveying the AI landscape in the museum context. The use of artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly common in larger museums, many of which are beginning to experiment with the technology's potential to provide new ways to engage with audiences, visitors, art, and objects. In 2019, Ariane French and Nalina Villa-Espasa identified 70 examples of AI projects within museums, primarily looking at the UK and the US. This study showed a common pattern: brilliant individuals leading on projects within individual institutions, with no consistent practice across the sector. What we do know is that AI technologies, including machine learning, predictive analytics, and machine vision, bring exciting possibilities of knowing more about visitors and collections. These technologies provide opportunities for museums to both collect and create data at a speed and on a scale they've not seen before. Slide. So what does this look like in a museum context? I'm going to give you some brief examples. The first one here is what we might call a relatively early example of public-facing AI in a museum context. The Tate IK Prize winners in 2016, Fabrica, who used a model with the title recognition to analyze live images that were being produced by news sources online against the collections database. An early example of computer vision or machine vision being used to identify visual patterns across collections. Whilst visual patterns can be really useful, if we think about the context of news, the visual pattern of that is not often represented when it comes to the collection or to the content and curation of our collections. Slide. Another interesting example of how this can be used within a collections database focus is that of search by colour, something that's particularly useful when we think about design collections, as we can see here in this example from Cooper Hewitt, the Smithsonian Design Museum. Slide. But what we know is computer vision and machine vision technologies are simply using pattern recognition. They don't provide the context that we as museum professionals and academics see when we look at visual images or we think about visual culture. Harvard Art Museums used a number of different off-the-shelf or readily available computer vision tools to analyze their collection. You can see in this slide 4 different computer vision services and what they see when they look at this piece of contemporary art. I think my favorite is that Microsoft is about 39% sure that this is a bathroom with some graffiti on the wall. So we can see here that whilst computer vision may be useful to catalog objects which have popular cultural references, it's not as useful when it comes to analysing cultural heritage objects that have nuance, or contemporary art objects that again don't follow pattern recognition as they're conceptual by nature. Slide. Beyond collection databases, AI technologies can be used to help us to curate or to manage exhibitions. The National Gallery, for example, developed a predictive analytics dashboard. They use data on an artist's popularity, drawn from Wikipedia, the art movement, the marketing spend, so how much money would be spent on the exhibition's marketing, how far through the run of an exhibition they were, the time of year, and the day of week, to analyse how popular or how busy an exhibition would be on any given day. This is a useful tool when we think about how we manage staff from a front of house perspective, but also a useful way of thinking about the size of an exhibition in terms of physical space in a museum, the name of an exhibition and how that may change or alter. For example, do we lead with the artist's name, or do we lead with the movement, which may be more popular in terms of web searches than the artist's name? But this then leads to ethical questions. By using these predictive analytics, are we therefore allowing the machine to curate the exhibition rather than the trained curator, the expert in the area? Slide. Increasingly, we're starting to see artificial intelligence being used in front of house, physically interacting with our visitors. In this example from Museum of Science in Boston, we see Ada and Grace, two virtual educators who answer visitor questions, suggest exhibitions, and explain how the technology that makes them work works. One of the technologies used in this example is natural language processing. Slide. And I always feel that as much as our research has looked very little at robots, they are expected in any talk about AI. So I always like to include Pepper. This is an example that is drawn from the Smithsonian Institute in America, who have been using SoftBank Robotics Pepper robot since 2018. They use it in a number of different ways. One of them is in the National Museum of African Art, where Pepper will translate Kiswahili phrases into English. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Pepper will help attract and orientate visitors to the Rosa Parks virtual reality experience. So we can see here two different applications of AI technologies being used. One, the natural language processing, being able to translate and communicate with visitors. Slide. However, we really need to place these uses within the wider landscape and shared language around how AI technologies are used in wider society before we can really begin to examine data collection processing challenges within museum context. In the UK and the US, we live in a data-saturated society with algorithmic decision-making policies and processes being used to decide on cancer treatment, prison sentences, and the price we pay for home or car insurance. Data saturation in the UK and the US has been brought about in two ways. Firstly, neoliberal ideals of metrics have popularized the collection of data for both states and individuals, from the state-controlled social credit system in China to the privately driven strive for personal development and health in the UK through technologies such as Fitbit. But secondly, the pervasive digital technologies have created new tools for the creation, collection, analysis of data on a scale we haven't seen before. So that data has powered change in society in quite a radical way. This slide shows some news stories from the last couple of years, which demonstrates the scale of debate around these technologies in wider society. Slide. So we're beginning to see this wider acceptance of data as a source of power and influence being adopted by museums, really echoing what we're seeing in wider society. Museums as social constructs are really adept at change, and so like they've done many times before, are tasked with developing new ways of working. And I quite like this quote. Paris centers this challenge on the ethical framework which scaffolds a museum construct. He says, as the museum moves into new social, situated, sensory and semantic media spaces, so its ethical framework needs to adjust and respond to the implications and consequences of these new interactions and interventions. Slide. Do we frame this then as a socially responsible museum? Adopting AI in a context-specific and culturally sensitive manner will be a complicated task, but a task that is possible. Again, this quote helps us to think about possible futures. Anytime we talk about an emerging technology, museums have an important role to play, teaching the public about it. Artificial intelligence is going to be incredibly important in shaping the world we live in profound ways. We need to understand the technology and the issues it raises. Slide. So in 2019, I received funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council to develop the Museums and AI Network. And our problem statement really centered around this moment of adoption. With an increasing awareness and regulation around data usage in wider society, museums must approach AI with both caution and curiosity. As such, exploring, critiquing, and understanding the ethical implications of AI within the museum context is increasingly becoming a pressing need for museums. Slide. So for the purpose of the Museums and AI Network and the purpose of this research project, we took the view that AI is not a single technology, but instead best understood as a plurality of technologies. What these technologies share is a core similarity. All that fall within this definition rely on data to enable them to function. Indeed, the conversation around AI is often oversimplified, with many of the technologies that sit within the popular understanding actually falling far short of sentient intelligence. Instead, what we're really seeing is advanced algorithmic decision-making. As such, it's important that museums not only understand the technology they intend to use, but also what data it will require as input and what data it will generate as output. It's this complexity and the near future applications and the science fiction and popular culture narratives that this research really took as its starting point. Slide. So what do? We developed a network. We created space for discussion, debate, and challenge. We created a format that was led by participants with a focus on conversation. And we encouraged the sharing of work in progress, a test bed for new ideas and challenges. Crucially, we wanted to create a chance to press pause, to think about the consequences of AI for museums, rather than the presentation that we see at conferences, which focuses on success rather than process. Slide. How do we do this? Well, we brought together 50 experts from 6 different universities and 15 museums in the UK and the US. And we also invited 200 members of the public to join us at public events. Slide. We sent out a survey when we contacted people and said, would you like to take part in these conversations? We sent out a survey and we asked people, what are the issues that you would like time and space to resolve? You can see on this slide some of the quotes from where participants really focused on issues around data privacy and ethics and biases. The slide. We did some desk research. We looked at existing codes of ethics. We looked at existing policies and laws that really frame how museums were using data within an AI context. A slide. We examined possible outputs. Initially through this project, we thought that we were going to write an AI code of ethics for museums. But what we realized from working with museum practitioners was that many, particularly from a digital focus, had never read a museum code of ethics. Indeed, many had been trained in computer sciences. So we're more familiar with relevant codes of ethics, for example, the Association for Computer Machinery, rather than the Museum Association Code of Ethics. Slide. Oh. So I'm going to get you just to click through some. These are just some photos to give you an idea of the types of kind of informal workshops we had. So slide, slide. Yep, slide, slide. Yeah, great, thank you. What we really then focused on was how do we turn these theoretical conversations into practice? We decided that we weren't going to write an ethics framework or an ethics guide because we didn't think anyone would read it or use it. So instead, what we really focused on was how do we make tools that will support organizational change, will allow people to think about issues such as the environmental impact of AI, but will also allow professionals to really embed conversations around the intended and unintended consequences of technologies at the idea creation stage of project development. Slide. So for a series of worksheets and workshops, slide, we prototype different workflow processes and different workshop formats. We iteratively developed these with digital leaders in the cultural sector. Slide. Slide. And we began to use these case studies to develop this framework of inquiry that would allow us to develop new modes of practice to support professionals engaging with these technologies. Slide. The central questions that our network really developed that we sought to create response to focused on two areas. The first was AI and visitor data, and the second was AI and collection data. And so you can see here some of the questions that were the starting point for workflow processes that we developed through the network. Some of them are quite obvious. Do museums have the necessary data governance and processes in place to manage AI? And some of them were wider and more conceptual. What are the implications of museums engaging with big tech companies? Slide. We took those questions and we framed them within the context of a toolkit or a working document. The working document asks, why AI? It begins to unpick some of the ethical understandings of how we use these technologies. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. It examines off-the-shelf tools and the pitfalls of using cheap but readily available technologies from a bias perspective. The toolkit also focuses on issues around quality assurance or human augmentation. How can you work with the machine rather than in parallel to develop museum practices? It focuses on bias management, but it also focuses on wider issues such as brand washing and critical technology discourse. Slide. Slide. I'm going to get you just to click through this slide. Animation's great when you have your own control. Yeah, perfect. Oh, sorry, next slide, yeah. So the case studies that I've discussed so far today in terms of thinking about what this context of AI currently looks like in museums really give you some indication of this critical juncture that we're at when it comes to using AI. But I think it also provides you an insight into this idea of blindly adopting what is possible and what is affordable from third-party websites is one very simple way of going forward. But actually, for me, I think there's a really interesting space where we can really be engaging with public, critical yet constructive processes of development that can support ethically robust technology development and ultimately can provide our visitors and our users with a digital literacy that allows them to better engage with these technologies in their wider lives. If we think about museum collections, they're full of subjective decisions that determine how art and objects are collected, categorized and displayed. And as such, in many ways, museums are well placed to develop strategies and processes that can quality assure the data produced by computer vision technologies. documentation of process, peer review of projects that engage with computer vision technologies are really key to developing this new mode of practice. In many ways, it could be argued that as computer vision moves from pilot project to standard practice, it will become as ubiquitous or indeed invisible within industry standard collection management databases. Slide. So you can see here some of the worksheets that we have developed that really allow those working at the intersection of AI technologies and data processing and cultural institutions to think about the capabilities of technologies at the very beginning of idea conception. So really starting to think about the internal capacity and capabilities of organizations, but also the relationship with external data processing or AI technologies or big tech companies. Slide. Also thinking about the legacy and longevity of projects, thinking about their external focus and partnerships within the wider management of a museum. Who are those external and internal stakeholders when it comes to thinking about data? And central to some of these issues are real issues around decolonization of our collections, about the language we use and the worldview that museums have. Slide. I've talked quite quickly through some of the workflow processes presented in the toolkit. The toolkit is free and it's open access, so I didn't want to focus too heavily on how this document works, but I encourage you to go and explore it yourself. The first toolkit was published a number of years ago, but in January, February, we've just published 2 new versions, a version in German, which has been collaboratively developed with a German network of museums, and also a version in Spanish. And both of these new versions have updated case studies in them. So they use the same workflow documents, workflow processes and workshop formats that we collaboratively designed with our UK and US partners, but they feature new German and Spanish case studies. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at the case studies that feature across the toolkits. But also, if you are thinking about developing AI processes in museums, do think about how you can use some of these tools and workshop formats to help you to develop those models. Slide. So really, in conclusion, what I really wanted to focus on today is firstly, introducing the idea that it's already here. Museums are already using machine learning and AI technologies to engage with their collections and their audiences. But also to advocate that we're at a really crucial moment when it comes to the adoption of these technologies. And I think that museums provide a really critical space where we can think about digital enlightenment. We think back to the origins of the Victorian era of museums. I think there's a similar moment now for digital enlightenment in the cultural sector. One of the areas that our work is quite focused on quite heavily is how we think about bias in the AI and museum space. And we frame this as bias squared. Bias squared being the inherent bias that we have in museums and cultural institutions in terms of how we collect, interpret, and use collections. When that's multiplied with the inherent bias that we see in the machine. Machines are not sentient beings, instead they're programmed by individuals. And so when we use AI technologies to engage with visitors or our collections, it's important that we remember that that process may be efficient and effective in some respects, but in other ways, it furthers existing and inherent biases. And so factoring in and reflecting upon the impact of bias squared on our work is crucial within an ethical framework in a museum or cultural heritage context. Slide. So in many ways, I hope that my brief talk today leaves you with a lot more questions and answers, because critical engagement with technology is key to its successful adoption. I've presented lots of questions. I've shown you some very brief case studies, but I hope that some of the questions that I've posed may be answered by the more in-depth case study focused presentations that you'll see this afternoon. And so with that, I'm going to thank Amelia, who has taken on the role as my beautiful assistant, my magician's assistant for my talk, and open it to questions.